So Johnny Herbert has just been fired then from being an F1 FIA steward, but who was he? Which races did he steward in 2024? Why was he dropped? And where do we go from here? So the statement the FIA put out then, which was apparently mutually agreed, says, "It is with regret that we announce today that Johnny Herbert will no longer fill the position of F1 driver steward for the FIA. Johnny is widely respected and brought invaluable experience and expertise to his role. However, after discussion, it was mutually agreed that his duties as an FIA steward and that of a media pundit were incompatible. We thank him for his service and wish him well in his future endeavours." But we have to bear in mind that Niels Wittich, the previous FIA race director, was let go in a very similar fashion. They put out a similar statement saying they've kind of agreed to part ways, but he came afterwards and said, no, like, I was just essentially fired. Like, I wasn't given a choice. It wasn't a mutual statement. So I think, honestly, this is more the FIA firing him. So who was Johnny Herbert then? I'm sure you guys have heard of him in some form, whether that be on social media or possibly on Sky, or maybe a little bit older as a driver in Formula One. So he was an F1 driver from 1989 to the year 2000. He won 3 races from his 160 starts. He actually also won a 24-hour Le Mans race as well. He also started that race 8 times and did manage to win it in 1991. He's also done many other races other than F1. He's done lots and lots of sports cars stuff, particularly after he retired from F1 in the year 2000. And he spent 10 years as a Sky F1 pundit from 2012 to 2022, which is personally where I am known best from. He started stewarding in 2010, which is when FIA first started doing driver stewards. What do stewards do then? Well, on F1 race weekends, it's their job to essentially apply the rule book. So what you normally see them doing is applying penalties or giving out sanctions in some way. They can only do that if they've been reported to them by an official, which normally is the race director, and they've got access to one TV angle from the car, all the TV angles away from the cars, circuit CCTV, and car telemetry. So the stewards are made up of 4 people, which tend to change for every single round. One of those people is appointed by the local circuit and the other 3 are appointed by the FIA. One of those people is made the chairman of the stewards and one is a driver steward, at least since 2010. But can you name many of the stewards? I mean, for me personally, I can't name too many off the top of my head. To be honest, Johnny Herbert was probably the one that most people would be able to name because he's been talked about a lot on social media. But his website I found online with a list of stewards. And honestly, for me, although this list is a bit outdated, it hasn't even got Johnny Herbert listed on it, for example, I don't recognise any of these names. I mean, for example, the 3 driver stewards, which are the ones you're most likely to recognise from 2024, were Johnny Herbert, Derek Warwick, and Vitantonio Liuzzi. Now, you've probably heard of those names before, but honestly, the rest of the names of people who I found were stewards in 2024, I'd never heard their name, and normally I know quite a lot about F1. But focusing on Johnny Herbert then, he officiated 8 races in 2024, which is exactly a third of the races, so they clearly split the driver stewarding evenly between those 3 people. Some memorable incidents he was involved with. First off, you've got Australia, which for me is the most memorable, and honestly it was the biggest, the worst decision that was made all season, which is when he gave Fernando Alonso a penalty for essentially lifting too early. You may remember George Russell had quite a big crash at the Australian Grand Prix, and the stewards gave Fernando Alonso a drive-through penalty for this, which is a 20-second penalty post-race. Essentially, George Russell crashed because he got bad dirty air and on worn tyres just ended up crashing. There was no contact with Alonso and he didn't even get that close. It's not like he had to take avoiding action on Alonso, but the stewards deemed that Alonso lifted too early, and I think in particular because he had to re-accelerate before getting on the brakes for the next corner, they deemed that that was a bit much. Now, for me, that, as far as I can recall, is the only real massively controversial stewarding incident in 2024. But Johnny Herbert was also involved in a couple of others you may remember. At Austria, for example, he gave Verstappen a 10-second penalty for his collision with Norris, which of course took Norris out of the race. That was up at turn 3. Verstappen just drifted over on him, made some contact, and Norris was out. So honestly, though, I think that was fair. Perhaps you could argue that 10 seconds was a bit much, but I think that was fair. Verstappen did just come into Norris. And in Mexico, where Verstappen, I mean, how do I even describe? Just dive bombed is the nice way to say it. Lando Norris in Mexico. And he was given 2 10-second time penalties for his driving in the Mexican Grand Prix. So you may remember some of those incidents, and Johnny Herbert was the driver's race steward for those races. But you have to remember, any steward is only a quarter of the panel. So even if you think, oh, okay, well, I hate all those penalties, it must be Johnny's fault. He's only a quarter of the panel. They're not going to only listen to that one voice. The other 3 people, well, at least 2 of the other people must have agreed, and we don't know. Johnny Herbert might have been against those decisions. So why was he dropped? Well, at the centre of this is the FIA saying that his media duties don't line up with his stewarding duties. And honestly, on the face of it, I do agree with that. It wouldn't make sense for someone to be, someone like Jack Villeneuve maybe, who's known to be controversial, known to create a headline, suddenly being a steward. People don't want someone controversial being a steward. So that kind of makes sense, but he's actually not been on Sky F1, as I mentioned earlier, since 2022. But what he's been doing over the last year or two is he's been giving quotes to gambling companies who then sell that quote to journalists. Now, a little bit weird on the face of it, but there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, effectively, he's using the gambling companies as an agency of some kind. And obviously, he's getting paid for the quotes, and then the gambling companies are getting paid by journalists for his quotes. So a bit odd, but nothing untoward there, to be honest. I mean, as far as I can gather as well, he doesn't do too much else other than stewarding and giving these quotes. I'm sure he does some other things around F1, but I don't think he's got any other kind of full-time role like he used to have at Sky. And as I said, he's definitely seen as a bit of a controversial figure, which, I don't know, do we think that's unfair? I mean, when you look at what I said earlier, he's only a quarter of the stewarding panel. He's only on 8 of the races in 2024. You can't even name most of the other stewarding panels. I really feel like he's been scapegoated a little bit. Certainly as a steward, I think when he's a Sky F1 pundit, you can disagree with him all you want. That's the point. He's there as a pundit. He's there to give his opinion, and not everyone's going to agree. I think some people think that Sky F1 as well is biased towards British drivers, which I think can definitely be considered fair. But I don't feel like Johnny Herbert is a massively controversial figure in general. I mean, let me know down in the comments if you disagree with that. But it's just weird that he's almost been scapegoated. It's his name we hear way more than anything else. One thing I will say though is I do think he was just a bit too public to be a steward. I think if you're out there that much, you're giving that many opinions, you're that well known, you shouldn't be a steward. I think the stewards need to just be going about their business quietly. You shouldn't really know who the stewards are because you don't want to get personal, and they should just be applying the rules fairly, which obviously, everyone's going to disagree. Look, everyone disagrees with the referees in any sport in the world. That's part of sport. But they shouldn't be controversial, and you shouldn't really know who they are. They shouldn't be making headlines. They should just be quietly going about their business. And I can't help but feel part of this is the perceived British bias as well. I mean, Ben Sulayem, the FIA president, has been on a bit of a crusade against British bias. At a recent event, he actually brought up British bias despite not being asked about British bias. So clearly he's on a bit of a crusade. I don't think that's the sole reason that Johnny Herbert's been let go, but I can't help but feel that is part of it, the FIA is trying to shed this British bias feeling that seems to be going around F1 at the moment. But what can be done in the future? Well, for me, I'm not surprised that he's been getting paid for quotes to a gambling company because stewards are unpaid. Stewards don't get paid for their work. They get expenses, so they get flown out. They may get flown out business class, very nice, and they get to go to an F1 race. I know that sounds lovely to me and you. But in reality, the sort of people you want to be a steward, you need to be paying them. Like, I'm not saying paying them millions, but pay them something. Because at the end of the day, it's not a part-time job. Johnny Herbert was going to 8 F1 races a year. Good luck finding a job where you have to take 8 essentially full weeks off a year. It's not really a thing. So then you put yourself needing someone who's maybe very rich, and then they've got their own biases. It should just be a paid role. I think stewards should also be more permanent. I could absolutely see a guest steward coming in. Maybe one of them should be a guest and the other 3 should be permanent or something, because obviously we do see some inconsistency. I think for the most part, the FIA got most of the calls right in 2024. I can't recall, again, please let me know if I missed any, but I can't recall any massive incidents that were completely done wrong. And there's a few little issues with the race director here and there, but again, that's just part of sport. But yeah, I mean, I think not being paid is why this has happened. I mean, being a pundit is one of the few jobs you can do alongside being a steward, but I also agree that it's not compatible. So they just got to start paying them. And it's F1, it's the FIA. They've got enough money to pay a few people, even if it's like 50 grand a year, which again, to me and you, that sounds great. 50 grand a year to go to some races and to sign me up. But to the sort of people you're going to attract, particularly ex-drivers and stuff, maybe that's not much, but at least it's a salary. That can pay your bills. So I think that's honestly at the core of the issue. This is a whole Johnny Herbert thing, but I think this FIA needs to resolve some issues with the stewards. There's no point in us going, yay, Johnny Herbert's been got rid of because I personally didn't like him. There's some bigger issues at play here. But anyway, we'll see what happens in 2025 and who they bring in to replace him. As I said, that nothing's changed. The stewards are still unpaid. The stewards are still temporary. You know, they're not permanent full-time stewards, although they do tend to cycle through the same ones. But yeah, bit of a weird one. Johnny Herbert, there it is. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to drop a sub if you haven't already, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.